This is the final sermon in the discipleship series that Pastor Kevin has been preaching. And so we're going to continue along those lines here today. Discipleship was really at the heart of the ministry of Jesus. And it's not surprising that the word disciple is mentioned over 250 times in the New Testament. In fact, the New Testament is a story about disciples written by disciples who wanted to make disciples. And those disciples changed the world. And that same mindset is what God is wanting for us today. But you see, discipleship to the disciples of Christ was a little different than what it is in our culture. In our culture, we just seem to have so many people who say, I'm going to follow Christ, but then we only do it when it's convenient for us. Where the disciples who followed Jesus, they abandoned everything to follow him. And it was that way whenever you followed a rabbi in the days of Christ, you were given it your all. You weren't just part way in, you were all the way in. Somebody said faith in Christ is not just a single step, it is a lifelong walk with him. So Jesus and his disciples had a very different view of discipleship. They made no distinction between being saved and living in obedience to God. To be saved was to be totally committed to a life of obedience, to walk as the rabbi walked, to become like him. So for a disciple who was following a rabbi, their goal was to go where he went, to be what he was, to look like him, to talk like him, to act like him, to smell like him, everything. They wanted to be just like the rabbi because they themselves wanted to become rabbis. I mean, think about the story when Peter walked on water. You remember that story? The disciples are out in the boat. There's a storm that's come up and it's kind of crazy. They're afraid. And Jesus comes walking on the water. They think they're seeing a ghost and they're freaking out because in those days they believed that if you saw a ghost, that meant that death was coming, basically. And so they're afraid because they think they're about to die. And Jesus says, hey, no, guys, it's me. And so they kind of calmed down, but they weren't convinced. And so Peter said, Lord, if it's really you, then make me do what you're doing. Make me walk on water. And Jesus said, come on. And Peter stepped out of the boat and he started walking on water. Remember that? Now, why did he do that? Why did Peter get out of the boat? Because that's where his rabbi was. And for a good disciple, they were going to follow the rabbi everywhere. They were going to do everything the rabbi did. Dallas Willard said, when Jesus walked among humankind, there was a certain simplicity to being a disciple. Primarily, it meant to go with him in an attitude of study, obedience, and imitation. One knew what to do and what it would cost. Family and friends were deserted for long periods to go with Jesus as he walked from place to place, announcing, showing, and explaining the governance of God. Disciples had to be with him to learn what he did. So years ago, I came across this teaching on what it meant to be a disciple, especially in the days of Christ. And it comes from the Mishnah, which is a collection of rabbinic thoughts. So the thoughts, the teachings, the sayings of various rabbis from 200 BC to 200 AD. And this teaching, this structure, was foundational to what they believed and how they acted, and it still is to some capacity today. So in those days, education was huge in the days of Christ. It was important to educators, students, parents. I mean, they really were into this. And the Mishnah has a phrase that says, above all, we pride ourselves on the education of our children. So this is the same system that Jesus would have come up under. And so here's how it was broken down. The Jewish education was broken down into three sections. First is Beit Sefer. And this is usually from the ages of 5 to 10. It's a time when a young boy, a young Jewish boy, is taught in the synagogue by the rabbi. During this time, good Jewish boys would memorize the Torah. That's the first 5 books of the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. By the age of 10, he would memorize that. The Torah was really important. They believed that God gave Moses the Torah to deliver to them, and it was the foundation of what they believed. So going on from there, the next one is Beit Talmud. And Beit Talmud goes from the ages of 10 to 14. And during this time, the student would continue his memorization of the Psalms, prophets, and the rest of the Hebrew Scriptures or the Old Testament. So it wasn't uncommon in that day for a good Jewish boy to have the Old Testament completely memorized by the age of 14. Anybody in here memorize the Old Testament? Yeah, don't feel bad. I'm not even close. But by the age of 14, a committed Jewish boy would have the entire Old Testament memorized. From there, they would progress on to Beit Midrash. And at the age of 14, the best of the best would continue to apply oral and written law from the Talmud, the Mishnah, sages, and years of commentary on the Scriptures. And each rabbi would have his own interpretation of the law. So, for example, when in the Ten Commandments, when it talks about honoring the Sabbath, some rabbis, because on the Sabbath you weren't allowed to do anything, you just were supposed to rest. And so for some rabbis, they would say you can walk no farther than from your home to the synagogue, while others might say, well, you have to get home, so you can walk to the synagogue and back, but you can't do anything else. And so you had the law, and you had the rabbi's interpretation of the law. And the rabbi's interpretation of the law was known as his yoke, which is interesting because when Jesus came, he said, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. In other words, he's saying, look, I'm not going to throw a lot of rules and regulations at you. I'm just going to tell you to follow me and do your best to be like me. And so you had the law, you had the interpretation of the law, the yoke. And whenever a rabbi would call a disciple to follow him, he would say, come, take my yoke upon you and learn of me and follow me. So at the age of 14, the best of the best, the Harvard and Yale of the Jewish boys would take this step. You see, all Jewish boys in this time wanted to be rabbis because rabbis were the most respected people on earth at that time. And so every Jewish boy wanted to be a rabbi. So at the age of 14, the best of the best would approach a rabbi and request to become his disciple. The rabbi would then quiz the boy. And if he quizzed you and determined that you were good enough, that you were indeed the best of the best, he would say, come take my yoke and be my disciple. And at that time, the boy would leave everything, his home, his family, his community, his synagogue, everything. He would abandon it all to follow that rabbi. And his goal was to be just like him. He wanted to sound like him. He wanted to learn from him. He wanted to talk like him so that he himself could become a rabbi. And this system continues to an extent today in Israel. And one of the sages from the Mishnah is quoted as saying, may you be covered in the dust of your rabbi. You see, rabbis were really passionate and charismatic, and they'd go around teaching, and they'd have their group of disciples following them. And while they'd be walking, they would literally kick up dust. And so the disciples who would be following closely behind, at the end of the day, would literally be covered in the dust of their rabbi. So the saying means, may you be following your rabbi so closely that you're covered in his dust. It's really a beautiful thing. But it applies to us today. Now, there is also the possibility that when a young boy would request to become a disciple of the rabbi, that the rabbi might test them, quiz them, and then in the end say, I'm sorry, you just don't have what it takes to be my disciple. And so at that point, they would tell him, go home, ply the family trade, make babies, and pray that they grow up to be better than you. That's essentially what the situation was. That you wanted to be a rabbi, you would come to the rabbi and request to be his disciple. If he said you're good enough, then you abandoned everything and followed him. If he said you're not, you don't have what it takes, then you go back home and you work the family business. You raise a family and hope that one of your kids can someday be a rabbi. And this brings me to our text today in Matthew 4:18 through 22. It says, one day as Jesus was walking along the shore of the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, also called Peter, and Andrew, throwing a net into the water, for they fished for a living. Jesus called out to them, come follow me, and I will show you how to fish for people. And they left their nets at once and followed him. A little farther up the shore, he saw two other brothers, James and John, sitting in a boat with their father Zebedee, repairing the nets, and he called to them to come too. They immediately followed him, leaving the boat and their father behind. So these four guys are working the family business because in all likelihood, at some point, some rabbi told them, you just don't have what it takes. And now as they're working the family business, here comes this rabbi down the beach. And he says, I know you've been rejected, but I think you have what it takes. Come follow me. And the scripture says that they immediately dropped what they were doing and went with him. They didn't say, can we have time to talk about it? Can we discuss this? They just went. Because again, every Jewish boy wanted to be a rabbi. They'd been rejected before, and now here comes this rabbi saying, I think you can do what I do. Come follow me. Of course they do it. And that brings me to our first point. He calls the rejected. And some of you may feel like God can't call me. He can call Pastor Kevin because he's nice and he preaches and he's funny. He has dad jokes and all this stuff. He can call Jim, the organist. He can call Dr. Ebert, the choir director, music director, bell choir director, everything that he does. He can call these talented people, but he can't call me. I don't do anything. But he's calling you right where you are. And even if you've been rejected before, he's still calling you today. In Matthew 4:19, Jesus said, come follow me and I will make you fishers of men. So here comes this guy down the beach. And he says, come follow me. And I love the fact that they didn't hesitate. They immediately went. He calls the rejected. Miss Thompson was a school teacher who every year would tell her students, boys and girls, I have no favorites. I love all of you equally. That probably wasn't true. I'm guessing teachers from time to time have students that they like more than others. I would think that would be normal. And there probably are times where teachers have students that they just don't like for whatever reason. Well, Miss Thompson had a student that she just wasn't crazy about. His name was Teddy Stollard. And Teddy was not really a likable kid. He wasn't interested in school. He always had this blank expression on his face. His eyes were glassy and unfocused. When she spoke to Teddy, he just kind of shrugged his shoulders. His clothes were messy, his hair unkempt. He wasn't attractive, and he certainly wasn't likable. Whenever Ms. Thompson would mark X's next to the wrong answers on his papers, she got a certain perverse pleasure from doing it. And when she would write the F's at the top of his paper, she would do it with flair. I mean, she should have known better. She had seen his records, and she knew more about him than she cared to admit. His records read this way. First grade, Teddy shows promise with his work and attitude, but poor home situation. Second grade, Teddy could do better. Mother is seriously ill. He receives little help at home. Third grade, Teddy is a good boy, but too serious. He's a slow learner. His mother died this year. 4th grade. Teddy is very slow but well behaved. His father shows no interest. Well, at Christmas time, the boys and girls all brought Christmas presents and they placed them on Miss Thompson's desk. And then they gathered around while she opened them. Among the gifts was one from Teddy Stollard. She really didn't expect him to bring her anything. And his gift wasn't very well wrapped. It was wrapped in some kind of brown paper and just held together with Scotch tape. On the paper were written the simple words, "For Miss Thompson from Teddy." Well, when she opened Teddy's present, out fell this gaudy rhinestone bracelet with half the stones missing, along with a small, cheap bottle of perfume. The other boys and girls kind of started to giggle over Teddy's gifts, but Miss Thompson at least had enough sense to put the bracelet on and put some perfume on and say, "Oh, boys and girls, doesn't this look so pretty? Doesn't my perfume smell so nice?" And they took the cue from their teacher and responded with oohs and ahs. Well, at the end of the day, all the students left, but Teddy lingered behind. He came up to Miss Thompson and he said, Miss Thompson, you smell just like my mother, and her bracelet looks real pretty on you. I'm glad you liked my presents." Well, when he left, Miss Thompson got down on her knees and asked God to forgive her. The next day, when the children came to school, they were welcomed by a new teacher. Miss Thompson had become a different person. She was no longer just a teacher. Now she was an agent of God, doing what she could to make things live on after her. She made sure that she helped all of the kids that struggled, especially the slower ones, especially Teddy Stollard. By the end of the school year, Teddy had shown dramatic improvement. He had caught up with most of the students and was even ahead of some. Once the school year ended, Miss Thompson didn't hear from Teddy for a while. And then one day she received a note that read, "Dear Miss Thompson, I wanted you to be the first to know I will be graduating 2nd in my class. Love, Teddy Stollard." 4 years later, another note came. "Dear Miss Thompson, they just told me I'll be graduating 1st in my class. I wanted you to be the first to know. The university has not been easy, but I've had a good 4 years. Love, Teddy Stollard." Another 4 years later, "Dear Miss Thompson, as of today, I'm Theodore Stollard, MD. How about that? I wanted you to be the first to know. I'm getting married next month, the 27th to be exact. I want you to come and sit where my mother would sit if she were alive. You are the only family I have now. Dad died last year. Love, Teddy Stollard." Well, Miss Thompson went to that wedding and she sat right where Teddy's mother would have sat, because she had done something for him that no one ever had. She had shown this rejected kid that nobody wanted. She had shown him that he was valuable and that he could do anything that he put his mind to. And Jesus has done the same for us. He calls the rejected. 1 Corinthians 1:26 through 31 in the Message says, "Take a good look, friends, at who you were before you got called, or when you got called into this life. I don't see many of the brightest and best among you, not many influential, not many from high society families. Isn't it obvious that God deliberately chose men and women that the culture overlooks and exploits and abuses, chose these nobodies to expose the hollow pretensions of the somebodies? That makes it quite clear that none of you can get by with blowing your own horn before God. Everything we have, right thinking and right living, a clean slate and a fresh start, comes from God by way of Jesus Christ. That's why we have the saying, if you're going to blow a horn, blow a trumpet for God." So do you really believe that Jesus thinks you can do it? See, that's the whole premise of this system. The rabbi doesn't call a disciple unless he knows the disciple can do it. So when Jesus calls you, he's saying, "I believe in you. Yes, you have faith in me. Now understand that I have faith in you. You can do what I do." And that's where we're at today. Now, here's the really cool thing. I love what Jesus did here. After he calls his disciples and he has them all together, look what he does next. In Matthew 16, 13 through 18, it says, when Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, who do people say that the Son of Man is? Well, they replied, some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah, others say Jeremiah or one of the other prophets. Then he asked them, but who do you say I am? Simon Peter answered, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Jesus replied, you are blessed, Simon, son of John, because my Father in heaven has revealed this to you. You did not learn this from any human being, and now I say that you are Peter, which means rock. And upon this rock I will build my church, and all the powers of hell will not conquer it. That brings me to the second point. He commissions the called. Not only does he call the rejected, he commissions, he sends out, he prepares, and he moves those that he's called. So here's the thing that Jesus did. He brought them to this city called Caesarea Philippi, this region. The region was ruled by a guy named Philip. And when Philip became ruler, he rebuilt and renamed the city after the emperor Caesar and himself. And so Jesus brought them to this place. Now, I want you to look at this picture up here. This is not just an ordinary place that he brought them to. This place was one of the hubs of pagan worship. So this was one of the most evil places on earth. And in this evil place, you see behind those buildings in this little painting, there's a big cliff. And people would climb up on top of the cliff and they would look down and watch pagan rituals taking place. You see where the arrow's pointing, there's a big hole. It's a big slit. Can we see that next picture maybe? Yeah, so you can see that a little bit better in this painting. The arrow points to this big hole. And this big hole, they believed, was like a bottomless pit. It was the place that they believed that spirits would enter the world and would leave the world. Sometimes they would throw people, apparently, this is what I've read, that they would throw people when they were doing human sacrifices, they would throw people into that big hole, this bottomless pit. Now here's the thing. That slit in the rock, that big hole, is known as the gates of hell. And so here Jesus brings his disciples to this place of idolatry, this hub, this evil place, and gets them to confess that he is the Son of God. This is powerful. And so I want you to imagine that Jesus is standing here in front of his disciples with this in the background. And he tells them, upon this rock, I'm going to build my church, and not even the gates of hell can stop it. You think he had their attention? I mean, they're like all in. They know what this means something to them. When he says the gates of hell can't even stop it, it might not mean much to us, but to them, that would have rang so true. It would have been a powerful moment. So here, in the face of idolatry, he gets them to admit that he is the Son of God. It's such a powerful story, powerful moment when this homeless, penniless Galilean carpenter with 12 ordinary teenagers, because that's probably what they were, teenage rejects that nobody else wanted. And he's got them in one of the most evil places on earth, confessing that he is the Lord of all, and he's commissioning them to go do what he's telling them to do. And he's telling them that not even hell itself can stop you. In John 15:16, he said, you did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you to go and bear fruit that will last. And right before he left and went to heaven, in Matthew 28:19, he said, go and make disciples of all nations. You catch that? I mean, Jesus is leaving. He's going back to heaven, And he's leaving it in the hands of these nobodies, these rejects. And they actually did it. They changed the world forever. Years ago, I was driving in my car and Paul Harvey came on the radio. You remember him? And he started telling this story about this small church youth group that decided that they were going to go to Manhattan, to New York City. Armed with trash bags, they were just going to go all around the city and pick up trash. And they were going to tell people about Christ if they would listen. And they said in their words, they were going to clean up the city of New York. People laughed at them, kind of mocked them. There's no way some small group of teenagers can make any kind of impact on a city like New York. Paul Harvey said, "Oh, I don't know. Seems like it was only about 2,000 years ago that a small youth group of only 12 changed the world forever." And that same God that called them and commissioned them is calling and commissioning you today. You see, there's a world full of people that are dying and going to hell. And one of the most important parts of being a disciple is realizing that our job is to take a message of hope and deliverance into a world where people need to hear. Never underestimate the person that Jesus sees, for he sees the potential in us all. What does Jesus see in me? People saw Saul, a murderer. God saw Paul, a great preacher. People saw David, a simple shepherd. God saw a great king. People saw uneducated fishermen. God saw world-changing disciples. People saw a thief on a cross. God saw a candidate for grace. He calls the rejected and he commissions the called. And Jesus is still calling the unqualified today. He's calling you to use you to build his church. And not even the gates of hell can get in the way because God himself has ordained it to happen. But it all comes back to you. Right where you are, Christ is walking down the beach, calling you to follow him. So may you recognize that call. May you see that you're worthy of that call. May you respond to that call. And may you always be covered in the dust of your rabbi.